Welcome to another Founder Wisdom Pod with Steve Tunstall. Steve is director and owner at Tunstall Associates. We're going to talk about a bunch of interesting topics, freedom, traveling the world, starting businesses. Steve started a lot in his career. He's now in Singapore. This podcast is brought to you by podfire.com. That's my podcasting company. If you want to start or scale a podcast and monetize it through unconventional methods, you can go to podfire.com. Steve, welcome to the pod. Tell me a bit more about yourself and about what you're up to nowadays.
Charles, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat. Tell me a bit about myself. So I'm fairly old. A lot of people at my age have retired already, but I just find work too exciting and too much fun, as long as you do it properly. I've traveled and worked all over the world. I've worked for many large companies and small companies. My preference is to work on my own as much as I can, or at least control the parameters of working so that I get to do the things I want to do rather than what other people would like me to do. And I've sort of created myself a Steve Tunstall shaped hole here in Singapore where I sort of get to be myself, and that's working out fairly well. I'm not going to be Elon Musk type wealthy, but I can do pretty well. I can raise my kids, and I'm having a good life.
So, what was the life vision you set for yourself, and do you feel you've accomplished that vision for you nowadays?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've got 3 teenagers, so we often have this question, and it's that old Arnie thing of, you better set yourself some sort of vision or mission, otherwise you are going to drift. And I have to say, I was really bad at that when I was young. I would say I didn't really get my head around what I wanted to do until I was in my 30s or 40s. And I don't think that matters. It's just you've got to really bear in mind that if you don't have a life vision, then, if you don't create your own choices in life, other people will create them for you. What I really wanted to do was to settle down, have a family. I started coming to Asia 35 years ago, so I'm originally from the UK, but I just loved it over here. So I wanted to sort out, well, how can I actually settle in Asia and get a meaningful life over here? And that was probably the vision. And then, of course, your tactics. How do you physically do that? How do you get jobs here? How do you get residency status? And now I have a passport. I'm a Singapore passport holder. How do you get to that point where you're really sort of locked in? Of course, now, as I say, I've got 3 teenagers, so my future's a little bit determined by them, because if they all go and live in different countries, then maybe I'll move again. But so far, so good, Charles, I'd say.
I also fell in love with Asia. Stayed in Hong Kong for a couple of months. I really loved it. It seems that you started a couple of business on your way there, or in your time in Asia. So did I back in the days. It was one of the best time of my life, being heads down and focused, building my startup. So tell us about your companies and what you've built so far.
So one of the most significant things that I do that really sort of pays the bills is I've spent a lot of my career working in risk management of one sort or another. I've always been fascinated by shit that goes wrong, quite frankly. So looking at how you can sort of stop that, how you can prevent it, led me to work at aviation, casinos, construction, all sorts of different areas like that. And I think one of the things that really came out of that is my ability to then look at things like crisis management, how you can sort of be ready for that. So now my main business, Tunstall Associates, is really about working as either an independent non-exec director or a consultant or a part-time risk manager for lots of different Asian conglomerates, because I can bring to them a wealth of experience and knowledge. And it doesn't mean I'm sort of upfront leading every time, but when the CEO says something that I think maybe needs a little bit of refocusing, then I can normally find a diplomatic way to sort of chip in, give him a few ideas, and then refocus a little more on something that's going to be more successful. So a lot of my work tends to be in the background, just nudging people to the right place. But I work for a lot of companies in Asia. I work for some of the largest banks, largest conglomerates, all sorts of areas. I'm particularly getting involved in sustainability and green transition. Asian companies have got a long way to go in terms of actually trying to stop screwing up the planet, but they need help with that. They can't do it on their own. So in addition to Tunstall Associates, I'm also set up a few NGOs. I'm on the board of Zero Waste Singapore. I do a few other things like that just to try and sort of supplement that, teach myself about the right paths, and then help some of the big Asian conglomerates as well along those same paths. But it's got to be a transition. You can't do a sort of close the door in their face thing. You've got to help them how they cope and state of their growth, because that's driven by sustainability in Asia as much as anywhere else.
You covered lots of events as well, like news that caught your eyes on your Twitter, on your LinkedIn. What has caught your eye in 2023, and what trends do you predict for next year in 2024?
So I think the overwhelming story of 2023 was AI. And I think where that's going to go and how fast that's going to develop, and what role that will play in technology, in social media, in life generally, I think is the big news story of 2024 as well. How that's going to play out, I think, is anybody's guess at this stage. I don't want to like him, but I like Elon Musk a lot and a lot of the things he says. And I sort of go with the flow on his view, which is he's about 80% positive and 20% negative. And I feel I'm in the same sort of boat. You know, this could all go really horribly wrong. And in some ways it is. I'm thinking in particular, the most, I mean, I read a lot, I watch a lot, I learn as much as I can. And the most popular TED talk last year was on geopolitics and how the tech companies are now essentially, this was Ian Bremmer who did this one, and basically the tech companies are sort of killing democracy globally, the way things are going at the moment. And that's probably not a good thing. It's that, and that when you sort of supercharge that with AI, that's really problematic. I think there's going to be a lot of potential downside, and being a risk manager, I think of that as well. But I think one of my biggest skills as a risk manager is saying, okay, so where's the opportunity? How do we get ahead of this curve? How do we drive this forward? How do we build a different business out of this? So I'm actually mostly positive about AI, but I do think there's a lot of potential for it to go horribly wrong. We've all seen the movies.
Yeah. Well, Hollywood is certainly not accurate. I do think so. And granted, the script writers that used to write these movies are being replaced with AI. I'm not sure if I'd listen to any of this. Although there have been good AI movies like Ex Machina, for example. Blade Runner was epic also. The new one, and Dune. I think is somewhat an accurate version of what will happen. But talking about Elon, I think even if he's not always right, you know, and no human is, and even if he has his quirks, at least I think he's honest and he's communicative about his views. Just that, yeah, when you have that much power and you're influencing crowds that do not have your intellectual level or maturity, you need to somewhat be careful. But what got me interested in what you just said is that big corporations are influencing democracy. I don't think that most corporations are doing humanity a service. I think they're taking way more, and specifically all the investors behind them. I think that's their fuel, you know, is like a cancer cell that's feeding off your blood nutrients. Well, what's that? Who's feeding the big corporate machines? Investors, you know, and most of the time it's wealthy investors that don't even look at what stocks they own, what impact they make. So how are you seeing these big corporations influence democracy?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, this is the first thing I would say is this is not new. This is like ancient history. So throughout time, the human race has been dominated by a handful of individuals who've controlled most of the wealth and most of the power, and nothing has changed today. So you go back and you look at whether it's in the US history, look at the robber barons and how they dominated things. And then, you get things like when JP Morgan himself died, everyone thought he was a super wealthy, rich man, but turned out 3/4 of his company was owned by the Rothschild family. So it's these investors behind the investors who tend to be the more super rich ones. And I think we're seeing that play out today. If you look at the likes of the Blackstones, the BlackRocks, some of these larger companies, they've got a massive influence on what happens in governments all over the world. It's not just in one country, it's every country. And if you, as the leadership of that country, if you get a bit too demonstrative, then they just take their business somewhere else. They don't care. Yeah. And it's your economy and your population that suffers accordingly. So they have a massive and disproportionate power that is effectively unmanageable and unmanaged. So you're absolutely right. They have their own agenda. If you look at big oil, I mean, Chevron were accurately modeling climate change 40 years ago, but deliberately suppressed it and then made sure that their lobbyists in Washington belittled the whole problem for the next 40 years, basically. These are just facts. It's not, it's not fiction. And then you look at the tech companies, I think almost always these days, every big social media company in particular, arguably with the exception of X, but it is arguably, is pretty well focused on being as divisive and nasty as possible, because the more clicks they can get, the more money they make. And the best way to get clicks is to make you angry and depressed. Then you don't go outside and get some fresh air and have a walk. You stay inside and you just keep scrolling and clicking and scrolling and clicking. So the more they can drag you down that hole of despair, the happier those companies are. And I think we've got to be careful, because those are now several of the largest companies on the planet. And that, again, is not changing fast. So I think overall, to your point, yeah, there's always a need for checks and balances. I don't think we've got it right at the moment, but I'm not also a big fan of big government. So I'm not sure what the best way to sort this out is. There's one thing for certain, we're no better now than we were during Roman times or the middle of the last century when there was war going on and people were getting conscripted. It's no different now than it was then. It's just different and more subtle forms of manipulation of the population.
Some of Tunstall Associates partner includes WWF, Marine Conservation Society, and so forth, Zero Waste, SG, and so forth. So how do you feel these organizations are helping the world be a better place, or the planet breathe, in the case of the companies / nonprofits that I named?
Well, I think the big issue for me is I've always been fairly interested in wildlife and stuff like that, and that's always been, being outside and walking has always been an interesting hobby of mine since I was a kid. And different times I get to do more or less in nicer or worse places, but it's always been there as a sort of key thing of mine. And then when I look at the stats that in my lifetime, we've managed to kill 70% of the wild animals on the planet. You look at dramatic things like that, and these are not made up stats. This is genuine stuff. And mostly that's carelessness of large corporations that really now we got to hold their feet to the fire a little bit more and say, hang on a minute, what you've had this free ride for so long, your shareholders have taken all this money. What are we going to do? How are we going to pivot your business model to do something that's actually better for the rest of us on the planet? So although I have empathy with the Greta Thunbergs of the world, and in the UK, the Just Stop Oil, and all these sorts of activists who take extreme measures or have extreme views or want to be very fast about the process of change. The reality is that a lot of large corporates that are incumbents, even if they want to change, they can't change quickly. It takes time. And what I've tried to do is I'd rather be inside helping them and nudging them in the right direction rather than outside just throwing mud, because that ain't going to change anything. And I can talk all day about this because this is a lot of what I do with the insurance sector and the finance sector, because those sectors are extremely important for influencing corporate behaviors both now and in the future.
Yeah, I think the finance one's pretty obvious. And talking about, yeah, extreme actions, I don't think they ever worked, you know. Extreme actions just bring more extreme actions, you know, they just bring revenge, just like terrorism, you know, I don't feel it ever had an impact. A positive one, that is. And tell me about insurance. You know, like for me, insurance might have a somewhat negative impact on the planet because of the amount of money and the amount of humans it's employing. It's a humongous industry, but tell me how insurance could possibly negatively be impacting the planet.
So I think one of the big issues with corporates, and I'm going to focus on corporates here. So I'm not talking about individual life insurance or policies, that sort of thing. I'm talking about corporate. So if you're a big corporate and you've got $1 billion worth of assets, you need to buy insurance to protect against damage of that in one form or another. Now, a lot of the insurers are based in either Europe or the UK. That's where their headquarters are. So they're now subject to pretty stringent sustainability regulations right across that area, which means that if you're a power company in India or somewhere else in Asia, then they're going to look at you. They've always looked at you as a bit of a problem because you're Asian. Now they look at you as oh my God, you're Asian and you're in power. So the possibility there, which often happens actually, is that they then decline to insure the company. If they decline to insure the company, that's really bad news for the company, but it doesn't change the situation on the ground. So what I've been doing is working with some really big companies, both insurers and large conglomerates, and saying, okay, let's continue to insure this company, please, but couple the insurance with the commitment to a transition plan so that you can do some stuff better in the future. And it might not be this year, it might not be next year, particularly in the case of coal-powered fire stations, things like that. These assets take 20, 30 years to work through their life. You can't just shut them down tomorrow. And I work with a couple of companies. I can't name the countries because it'll be obvious who they are. They've got like a lot of coal-fired power. And, you know, they might have a captive customer base of 20 million, but they're in the third world. So only 10 million can afford their electricity now. If you just cut off their insurance and tell them they've got to shut everything down and go to solar tomorrow, that's just not practical, because that will double the price of the electricity and half of their existing customers won't be able to afford it anymore. So from a broad sustainability point of view, all you've achieved is pushing another 5 million people back into poverty, which is not really very helpful. But if you can work with that company, say, yeah, we're gonna support your insurance program, but it's conditional on this. You've got to demonstrate genuinely how you're moving from A to B in terms of what you're doing in the future. And I think for me, this is a very powerful aspect of the insurance sector that I work quite hard to make sure that's leveraged as much as possible in Asia, because if it's done in the right way, I think it's extremely constructive.
I want to ask, to finish this off, you seem to be leading a pretty active lifestyle. What's your routine at this age, and how are you keeping your brain fit?
I do a lot of different things. I think exercise is top of the list. So I tend to walk a lot. So sort of that zone two burn, a little bit faster than this. So I'm slightly breathless usually, but I want to talk to you and I want you guys to understand what I'm saying without the panting. And I do 3 to 4 hours a day walking, at least 10 miles a day. That I do sort of 30 minutes to an hour of stretching and weights, 30 minutes swimming. And I don't achieve this every day. I aspire to this every day. And then I couple that with I monitor my sleep quite closely. I again try and get over 7 hours every night and monitor the sleep cycle somewhat. I try and eat sensibly. I'm fairly low carb, but I'm not religious about it. I had a McDonald's yesterday and I loved it. But you know, I mean, that's life. Huh? You can't. Nobody's perfect. So I try and eat a lot more veg, a bit more fish, protein and veggies rather than carbs. But I'm also let down by my sweet tooth, so that doesn't help either. And then the other thing I do is I take quite a lot of different medications. I dabble in a lot of different things. So I'm a fairly big fan of people like Peter Attia and David Sinclair. So I take NMN, which is an NAD precursor. I take resveratrol. I take rapamycin once a week. And a few other things just to sort of top that up. These are some of the, as I'm sure you're aware, on both the East Coast and the West Coast in the US, are some of the most advanced medical research into scientific proof of potential longevity benefits of these drugs. So I tend to follow quite closely what's going on, but from a layman's perspective there. So it's quite a complicated mix of things, but I think the big one from a work perspective is if I take on too much work, then all of that's going to start suffering. And this goes right back to what we said at the start about if I then get back on the corporate mouse wheel, I can't do all those other things because I just don't have enough hours in the day. So that's why I still work part-time. A lot of people say they don't know how I fit everything in. I have about 20 corporate directorships. But basically, I make sure I manage that in a way that I'm comfortable with. And we're here at the moment. It's 8:30ish in the morning over here in Singapore. And I won't properly start work until about 10:30 because I want to get all my other exercises in.
And how old are you?
I'm in the weird position that I'm slightly older than the country of which I'm now a citizen of. So I'm 60 next year.
60. How long do you want to live?
As long as it's fun, really. I try to keep a lot of humility about this, but I've built an income stream and a lifestyle now that means that retiring will be a step backwards, not a step forwards.
100%.
So when I'm forced to retire, that's probably when I want to die as well, to be honest.
I have the same philosophy.
Yeah.
And what would be your top 3 goals for this year in less than 30 seconds?
I think keep building the solid base of my income, make sure that I've got more diversity in that, maintain my fitness. I just checked, I averaged 24,000 steps a day in 2023. I want to do at least 20,000 next year. And I've done that now since COVID at that level. I want to see my family happy and well. I've got a 18-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 13-year-old, and they're all very different from each other. They're all facing the strange challenges of the strawberry generation. which I empathize with. I'm not one of those, oh, give them a smack on the ass and they'll be okay. I'm just not interested in that approach. It's like, no, they have genuine worries at that age and concerns, and they don't seem, or they don't feel to me as though they're as well equipped to deal with them as I was at their age. So that's probably one of my biggest concerns for 2024 is how do I keep the cotton wool around them without making them too soft?
Love it, Steve. You're really inspiring. Thanks for today. Where can people find out more about you?
Just check out my family name, tunstall.sg. That's my personal website, and then tunstallasc.com. And if you just put Steve Tunstall in the internet, you'll come up with a whole load of things that have got my name on them anyway. Probably the whole of page one of every social media platform you search on will have Steve Tunstall as the top link.
All right. That was another Founder Wisdom podcast with Steve Tunstall and Charles Cormier as your host. Thank you all. See you soon.